April 7th, 1945. The East China Sea lay under a low grey ceiling of clouds, its surface whipped into a chop by a brisk spring wind out of the southeast. On that slate expanse steamed the most powerful battleship ever built. Yamato, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the floating embodiment of an empire's fading dream. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito stood on the flag bridge, his uniform immaculate, his face expressionless beneath his peaked cap. Beside him, Captain Kōsaku Aruga paced the starboard wing of the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. Around them, the bridge crew murmured clipped reports wind direction, bearing of escort vessels, engine revolutions. Beneath their feet, 80,000 tons of steel pushed through the grey water at 23 knots, the great hull shuddering slightly with each turn of the twin screws. At precisely 1300 hours, the lookouts on the foremast shouted a warning. Enemy, aircraft sighted, bearing 340. Tiny specks appeared against the northern sky dots at first, then glints as sunlight flashed off metal wings. Ito lifted his binoculars. What he saw ended any illusion that this mission was about honor or glory. The dots multiplied by the dozen, then by the 100. Those were carrier planes, Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats launched from Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. They had found Yamato barely 4 hours after she had cleared the southern tip of Kyushu. Operation Tengo had never been a plan of victory. It was an act of national suicide masked as strategy. When orders reached Yamato at Tokuyama 3 days earlier, they had come directly from the Imperial General Headquarters. Sortie to Okinawa with minimal escort, attack the American invasion fleet, then beach the ship and use her guns as stationary artillery until destroyed. The ship carried only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The engineers knew it. The sailors whispered it in their mess decks. Even Aruga, the most loyal of captains, had pleaded with Ito to cancel the operation. But Ito had merely said, "If the Emperor commands it, we sail." Now they were paying that price. Yamato's main battery, 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, began to elevate, their 3 turrets rotating ponderously on hydraulic gears. The barrels pointed uselessly skyward, unable to depress far enough to strike aircraft. Each gun could hurl a 1.5-ton shell 26 miles, but against the diving shapes coming from the clouds, they were impotent. Aruga clenched the bridge railing. "We were built for a different war," he muttered. The first wave hit at 13:10, 90 aircraft in all, 54 dive bombers, 27 torpedo planes, and a dozen fighters. The escorts, the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, opened up with their anti-aircraft guns. Red tracers slashed across the grey sky. The thunder of Yamato's secondary batteries joined in, the twin 5-inch mounts barking rapid bursts. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. From above, Lieutenant Commander Hugh D. O'Neill of Air Group 9 dived his Helldiver straight into the maelstrom. "Target in sight," he reported. "Largest warship ever built commencing attack." He rolled over into his run, releasing his 500-pound bomb at 3,000 feet. It struck amidships, just abaft the bridge, detonating on the upper deck and sending a column of flame skyward. Below decks, shockwaves ripped through compartments. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Fire parties raced forward carrying hoses, but within minutes another bomb hit near the number 1 turret. The blast jammed the elevation gears. The biggest guns on Earth were frozen in place. On the flag bridge, Ito remained calm. "Damage control to forward section," he ordered quietly. "Maintain in formation. Continue firing." Torpedo planes approached from the port side Grumman Avengers, sleek and steady at wave-top height. The ship's gunners screamed warnings. Automatic 25mm mounts opened up, spewing shells so fast that barrels glowed red. Still, the Avengers pressed in. 1 torpedo struck near frame 145, port side. The impact lifted the entire hull, throwing men off their feet. Water roared in through torn plating. Within minutes, Yamato began to list 5 degrees to port. "Counterflood starboard," Aruga ordered. Pumps roared to life, filling opposite compartments to balance the weight. The list slowed, but the ship's speed dropped. At 13:25, another torpedo slammed home, then another. Yamato rolled further. The deck slanted underfoot. Men struggled to keep their balance as shell cases slid across steel. The great ship was bleeding to death. Above, American pilots radioed astonishment. "She's still going," one shouted. "She's taking everything we've got." By 13:30, the second wave arrived 150 more aircraft. The sky darkened with their silhouettes. Bombs fell in clusters, splashing fountains of fire and steam. Fragments tore into gunners at their posts. Ammunition lockers detonated, sending orange blossoms of flame through the superstructure. Inside the plotting room, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto, no relation to the late Admiral, studied the instruments. "Main battery unresponsive," he reported. "Power conduits destroyed. Elevation and training motors offline." The order came from the bridge: "Cease main battery fire. Continue with secondaries." The great guns fell silent, their muzzles blackened, their purpose ended. Ito turned to Aruga. "Captain, we cannot reach Okinawa. I will not waste lives needlessly. Prepare to abandon mission." Aruga shook his head. "We will fight to the end, Admiral. For the crew's sake." At 13:50, Yahagi took a torpedo amidships and capsized. Her boilers exploded as she rolled. The destroyer Isokaze vanished in a sheet of flame minutes later. The American aircraft wheeled for new runs, methodical, precise. By 1400, Yamato had taken at least 10 torpedoes and 7 direct bomb hits. Fires raged from bow to stern. The list exceeded 15 degrees. Water poured into the engine rooms. Below decks, hundreds of men were trapped as watertight doors jammed under twisted pressure. On the bridge, the wind carried the stench of burning fuel oil. Aruga stood at the compass repeater, the deck now tilting steeply. "Signal to destroyers, rescue survivors," he said. "All hands, prepare to abandon ship." Vice Admiral Ito refused a life jacket. "The fleet has fought well," he said softly. "Tell them Japan still has spirit." At 14:20, a final torpedo struck starboard, near the magazines. The shock ignited stored powder, bags for the No. 3 turret. The explosion ripped through the aft hull. Flames blossomed hundreds of feet into the air. Witnesses aboard nearby destroyers later reported a column of fire towering higher than the clouds, followed by a thunderclap that rolled across the sea. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. The largest battleship ever constructed, armed with the biggest guns ever mounted on a warship, had sunk without firing a single shot at an enemy ship. Out of nearly 3,000 men, barely 300 survived, pulled from the oil-slicked water by Japanese destroyers before more American planes drove them off. From the American carriers, observers watched the column of smoke rising from the horizon, a dark flower blooming on the sea. One pilot radioed, "Biggest explosion I've ever seen." "She's finished." The East China Sea closed over the wreckage at 14:23. What remained of Yamato settled upright in 350 meters of water, her great guns still pointing uselessly skyward. The empire that built her would follow within 4 months. The lesson was written in steel and salt water. In an age of air power, even the mightiest fortress of the sea could die in daylight, surrounded by its own dead, without ever glimpsing the enemy that destroyed it. 3 days before her death, Yamato lay moored at Tokuyama, her hull streaked with rust, her crew gaunt from rationed rice and sleepless nights under American bombers. On the morning of April 4, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered its remaining officers aboard for what would be their last briefing. The orders came sealed with the vermilion stamp of the Combined Fleet Headquarters, Operation Tengo, a sortie of death. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito unsealed the envelope with deliberate calm. Around the table sat Captain Kōsaku Aruga, Rear Admiral Keitsu Komura of the destroyer Yahagi, and several staff officers from the Second Fleet. The document was brief, almost absurd in its simplicity. Yamato, Yahagi, and 8 destroyers were to sail from Tokuyama, proceed south through the Bungo Strait and then east toward Okinawa. Upon reaching the American invasion beaches, Yamato would beach herself bow first, her giant guns turned inland to serve as a stationary fortress, an unsinkable gun battery to repel the landing. There was no mention of fuel for the return journey. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Admiral Ito's face was a mask of composure, but his adjutant later recalled that the Admiral's hands trembled slightly as he refolded the orders. "This is not strategy," he said. "This is desperation turned into paperwork." For months, Japan had been dying in pieces. The Imperial Navy that once ruled the Pacific now hid in caves and coves, starved of oil and aircraft. American carrier groups prowled the inland sea at will. B-29 bombers roamed unchallenged over the home islands. The Empire's shipyards were silent, its fuel stores nearly empty. Yet, even then, Tokyo demanded miracles. Operation Tengo was conceived in the warped optimism of men who refused to believe defeat was possible. The army wanted a gesture of defiance. The Navy was ordered to provide one. The logic was ritual, not tactical, an act of sacrifice to inspire the dying homeland. Captain Aruga, a practical sailor to the core, confronted Ito privately. "Sir," he said, "if we sortie, we will die within hours. The Americans control the air. We have no escorting aircraft, no reconnaissance, and not enough fuel to maneuver." Ito looked out the porthole at the calm inland sea. "I know," he said simply, "but if we refuse, we dishonor the men who built her." The Yamato had always been a symbol more shrine than ship. Laid down in 1937 at Kure Naval Arsenal, her construction was hidden even from Japan's allies. Her armor belt was over 16 inches thick. Her main guns, 18.1 inches in diameter, could fire shells heavier than a small car. She embodied Japan's faith that spirit and steel could overcome any enemy. But by 1945, that faith had become a curse. In the chart room that night, the navigator calculated their range. With full bunkers, Yamato could steam 7,000 nautical miles. The oil they had now, barely 4,000 tons, would take them less than 500. It was, quite literally, a one-way ticket to oblivion. The men understood. On April 5th, crews wrote farewell letters and burned them in tin cans on deck. There was no way to deliver them. Some carved their names into bulkheads, others tied white headbands around their foreheads, invoking the spirit of the kamikaze. That same night, U.S. Navy codebreakers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted the dispatch ordering Yamato to sortie. The message, decrypted at Pearl Harbor, reached Admiral Raymond Spruance within hours. The Americans knew every bearing, every timetable. The hunter would become the hunted. At dawn on April 6th, Yamato's engines rumbled to life. The harbor echoed with the sound, a deep, metallic heartbeat. Civilians gathered on the shore, waving flags and shouting "Banzai" as the colossal ship moved down the channel. Many wept openly. They were watching Japan's pride sail into history. From the destroyer Asashimo, Ensign Yutaka Matsuoka later wrote, "We all felt it. Not excitement, resignation. The ship was too beautiful to die, yet we all knew she would." By noon, the formation cleared the Bungo Strait and entered open sea. The weather turned foul, grey rain squalls sweeping across the horizon. Radio silence was ordered. Lookouts scanned the skies for American aircraft, knowing they would come. Admiral Ito remained on the flag bridge, wrapped in a greatcoat, staring east. He had opposed this mission until the final hour. Only the personal insistence of the Naval General Staff that Japan needed a final gesture of the Imperial Navy's spirit had broken his resistance. At 1900 hours, Yamato's wireless operators received an intercept from the mainland. American carrier task forces had been sighted south of Kyushu. Aruga requested permission to turn back. Ito refused. "We sail until the end," he said. That end came sooner than anyone imagined. At dawn on April 7th, radar operators picked up multiple contacts approaching aircraft at 60 miles. The crew went to battle stations. The forward magazines were unlocked. But there was no illusion left. When the first American planes appeared out of the clouds at 1300 hours, the great guns of Yamato elevated in defiance, symbols of a vanished age. By 1500 hours, she was a burning ruin. By 1523, she was gone. Operation Tengo had lasted just 10 hours. 9 ships had sailed, 6 were sunk. Nearly 4,000 men died for an illusion. In post-war interrogations, surviving Japanese officers described the mission in one phrase, gyokusai, honorable annihilation. Yet even among them, there was bitterness. It was not honor, said Lieutenant Yoshio Matsumura, Yamato's gunnery officer, in 1946. It was waste. We had the biggest guns in the world, and we died without using them. The operation proved, beyond doubt, that industrial power had replaced martial spirit as the currency of victory. Air supremacy rendered armor irrelevant. The Yamato had been designed to fight battleships. She perished in an era that had already moved on. When divers found her wreck decades later, the guns were still elevated toward the sky, as if reaching for enemies she could never touch. The empire that built her followed her into the deep. In the years before the war, when Japan's empire still glittered under banners of expansion and destiny, the idea of Yamato began not in a shipyard but in a belief. It was the conviction that spirit could conquer steel, that willpower could outweigh arithmetic. The architects of the Imperial Japanese Navy lived under a shadow of numbers. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had frozen their ambitions, limiting Japan to a ratio of 3 ships for every 5 built by Britain or the United States. For 2 decades, Japanese officers measured their fleet in fractions and compromises. Battleships, the supreme measure of power, were capped, monitored, and counted by foreign diplomats. But treaties were made to be broken. By 1934, Tokyo had walked out of the system entirely. "We shall build ships no enemy can match," declared Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then Vice Minister of the Navy. His statement was not boastful but defiant, a promise that Japan's isolation would be answered with audacity. In secret meetings inside the Naval Technical Department, planners drafted the outline for a ship so powerful that it would guarantee victory in a single engagement. They called it Special Project A. Its specifications were beyond precedent. Displacement over 70,000 tons at full load, armor thicker than 16 inches, and guns of such caliber that no foreign navy possessed the steel to resist them. At the Kure Naval Arsenal, engineers worked beneath wooden roofs, built to hide the scale of their construction from foreign reconnaissance aircraft. Workers were sworn to silence. Even the Emperor's advisors received only vague descriptions. They laid the keel in November of 1937. The hull took shape in shadow, a mountain of steel rising behind fences patrolled by armed guards. She would be named Yamato, after Japan's ancient heartland. The name was chosen by the emperor himself. It meant great harmony, but in that age it carried another weight, the myth of Japan's divine origin, the promise that her people could never truly be conquered. The ship's main, battery of 9 18.1-inch guns, was the largest ever conceived. Each gun weighed over 150 tons and could fire a shell nearly 1.5 yards in diameter, capable of punching through 30 inches of armor at 20 miles. In theory, Yamato could strike an American battleship long before its own guns came within range. In practice, the sea would prove a far more complicated battlefield. Inside the sealed foundries of Kure, machinists labored for months to bore each massive barrel to perfection. Every shell required new machinery, new presses, new cranes, entire factories built solely to feed one ship. To protect her magazines, the designers devised an armor citadel unlike anything before. Multiple belts of steel, a honeycomb of watertight compartments, and layered decks meant to deflect plunging shells. The combined armor weighed more than the entire hull of a cruiser. The costs were staggering. Each month consumed more steel than a dozen destroyers. Fuel tanks alone held 6,000 tons of oil, a resource that by 1944 Japan could scarcely find. But the logic was absolute: one ship that could outfight any 2, perhaps any 3, of the enemy's best. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff called it the embodiment of Kantai Kessen, the doctrine of decisive battle. According to this strategy, Japan would lure the US Pacific Fleet across the ocean, bleeding it with submarines and aircraft until a single climactic engagement near the homeland annihilated it. Victory would not come through attrition or industry, but through one supreme moment of precision and courage. It was an alluring fantasy, and like all fantasies, it survived only so long as it was not tested. When Yamato was launched on December 16, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor, her existence was still a secret. To most of the world, the Imperial Navy's strength lay in its carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, whose aircraft had shattered the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The new battleship remained hidden, her hull painted dark grey, her crew sworn to silence. She would be the blade held in reserve for the final duel. At first, her aura seemed justified. She became the flagship of the combined fleet, carrying Admiral Yamato himself to the Battle of Midway. In June of 1942, she steamed far behind the carrier groups, ready to crush any American survivors of the air battle that would, Japanese planners believed, destroy U.S. naval aviation for good. But the air battle was not won. 4 Japanese carriers went down in a single day. Yamato's great guns never fired. The decisive battle had taken place, but it had been fought not with artillery, but with aircraft. That day marked the beginning of the end, though few recognized it. After Midway, Yamato spent most of the war waiting. She anchored at Truk, at Linga, at Kure always ready, seldom moving. Her crew drilled endlessly, polished brass, repainted hull plates, and watched from a distance as other ships went out and never came back. She was too valuable to risk and too slow to lead. The Empire's oil convoys were dying under submarine torpedoes. Each sortie consumed fuel that Japan could not replace. By 1944, the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were monuments to a vanished confidence. When Musashi sailed to Leyte Gulf in October of that year, she faced a storm of American carrier aircraft, nearly 200 planes attacking in waves. 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs tore her apart. Her armor meant nothing. She went down in the Sibuyan Sea, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The survivors of Musashi's destruction returned to Kure and told the truth that the admirals refused to believe. The age of the battleship was over. No thickness of armor could stop a coordinated airstrike, yet the Navy clung to its dream. The war had begun with Yamato as its secret weapon. It would end with her as its martyr. The ship that had never found her decisive battle would be sent to create one not in victory, but in spectacle. By early 1945, the arsenals that had built her were rubble. The factories that forged her armor were silent. But still she stood at anchor. Immaculate, enormous, and useless, a relic of an empire that could not admit its own obsolescence. When the final orders came for Operation 10 Go, even her engineers knew what it meant. They had built the strongest ship in history and condemned her to fight a war that no longer existed. As Yamato's crew prepared to sail into the East China Sea that April morning, they did so not as warriors of the future, but as ghosts of a past that refused to die. The greatest battleship ever made was about to prove, beyond all argument, that her time had already passed. By 1945, the sea no longer belonged to ships. It belonged to the sky. The transformation had been slow, then, sudden like the tide creeping in, unnoticed, until it drowned everything that once stood firm. For the sailors aboard Yamato, this truth arrived not as theory but as thunder. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on the lessons of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo had crushed the Russian fleet through perfect gunnery. Battleships were temples of that faith mass, armor, and firepower incarnate. Yet, as Yamato steamed south toward Okinawa, the gods of naval war had changed. In their place stood aircraft carriers floating airfields that hurled death from beyond the horizon. The shift had begun years earlier. At Pearl Harbor, Japan itself had proven the power of carrier aviation. 6 decks of aircraft had destroyed 8 American battleships in 2 hours, demonstrating that range and altitude now ruled over armor and caliber. Yet, even then, Japan failed to grasp its own lesson. The battleship remained sacred. To question its supremacy was to question the soul of the Navy. By the time Yamato sailed on her final mission, the Americans had perfected what Japan had pioneered. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher under the overall direction of Admiral Raymond Spruance, represented the industrial zenith of naval air power. 15 carriers, 9 battleships, and over 1,000 aircraft. Each carrier launched squadrons capable of striking hundreds of miles away without ever being seen. Yamato, for all her immensity, could fire no farther than 26 miles. The contrast was obscene. The largest warship ever built, bristling with armor, guns, and pride, could be undone by pilots half her age flying machines made of aluminum and canvas. At the dawn of April 7th, when radar first picked up incoming aircraft, Yamato's officers still hoped to close the distance to bring their guns to bear. The plan was simple. If they could reach Okinawa, the ship's 18-inch guns could turn the beaches into firestorms. But the ocean itself had become a trap. Overhead, American search planes shadowed the Japanese formation, relaying position reports to Mitcher's task groups. At 10:35, the first wave of Helldivers and Avengers took off from Bennington, Essex, and Hornet. By noon, they had found their quarry. The attack unfolded with mathematical precision. Bombers struck from altitude, torpedo planes from sea level, fighters strafing in between. It was a symphony of destruction orchestrated by radar, coordination, and fuel logistics, the very tools Japan lacked. From his seat in the cockpit of an Avenger torpedo bomber, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dyer of Air Group 17 later recalled, "She looked unreal, like a mountain moving through the sea. Every gun on her was firing. The air around her shimmered with tracers. But you could feel it even from miles away. This was the end of something vast." For the Americans, the attack was not vengeance or hate, it was arithmetic. The Navy's after-action report recorded that 386 planes participated in the strike. 229 aircraft engaged Yamato directly. 49 bombs and 11 torpedoes found their mark. The operation consumed 55,000 gallons of aviation fuel, less than Yamato herself burned in a single day of cruising. For the Japanese sailors, each hit was a personal apocalypse. Below decks, the great ship groaned as explosions rippled through her compartments. Steam pipes burst, electrical circuits shorted. Men were scalded alive in the engine rooms, blinded by darkness and smoke. Above, the main battery crews trained for a gun duel that would never come could only watch the sky disintegrate. At 13:40, a torpedo struck near the after magazines. Flames raced along powder bags stacked 3 decks deep. Lieutenant Yutaka Koyanagi, stationed in the aft plotting room, remembered hearing a sound like the tearing of the earth. The ship shuddered from stem to stern. Moments later, all lights went out. The ship's damage control teams fought heroically, pumps screaming, hoses snaking across decks slick with fuel. But it was useless. The list grew sharper, the rudder jammed, steering failed. From the destroyer Yukikaze, Captain Terauchi observed the moment of death. The battleship ceased being a ship, she was a volcano. At 14:23, Yamato erupted. The explosion of her magazines released the force of 6,000 tons of explosives. A shockwave flattened clouds, hurled wreckage 10,000 feet into the air, and killed nearly everyone still aboard. The fireball was visible from 100 miles away. The US pilots orbiting the burning wreckage were stunned into silence. One aviator whispered over the radio, "She's gone. My God, she's gone." In that moment, an entire era vanished beneath the waves. Yamato's death was more than a loss of steel and men, it was the extinction of a philosophy. The age of armor had yielded to the age of air. The decisive battle that Japan had dreamed of since Tsushima had arrived, but not in the form they imagined. There was no line of battle, no thunderous broadside, only the silent geometry of radar-guided squadrons and the cold precision of logistics. In the post-war years, analysts at the U.S. Naval War College would write that Yamato's sinking marked the final validation of carrier doctrine. For Japan, it marked the moment when courage met technology and broke. Captain Aruga went down with his ship, his body never recovered. Vice Admiral Ito remained on the bridge until the end, refusing rescue. Survivors pulled from the sea reported his final words, "Let the Empire's spirit sink with her." But the Empire did not need spirit. It needed fuel, planes, and pilots, and those were gone. When American divers surveyed the wreck decades later, they found Yamato upright, her bow buried in silt, her turrets still facing east. The barrels of her giant guns pointed skyward, forever reaching for enemies she could never touch. The sea had claimed her, but history had already moved on. The battleship had been conceived as the ultimate expression of national strength. Its demise proved that strength without adaptability is only vanity. The thunder of Yamato's guns never echoed across Okinawa. Instead, the sound that ended her was the whine of engines, the new voice of power in the 20th century. In the East China Sea, that April afternoon, the sky did not merely kill a ship, it killed an age. In the long silence that followed April 7, 1945, Yamato disappeared beneath the East China Sea, leaving nothing but an oil slick stretching for miles and fragments of men floating among the waves. The survivors, barely 200 from a crew of over 3,000, were pulled from the water by destroyers Yukikaze and Fuyutsuki. The rest vanished into the deep. But the ship did not end there. Her ghost lingered, heavy as the steel that bore her name. For years, Japan refused to speak of her. In the war's aftermath, when the nation lay in ashes and surrender became its only law, the memory of Yamato was too painful to confront. Her story was both triumph and tragedy, a masterpiece of engineering and a monument to futility. To the generation that built her, she was a fallen god. To the generation that followed, she was a warning. At first, all that remained were rumors. Fishermen off Kyushu told of a shadow under the water, vast and still. American intelligence files contained sketches, debriefings, and a final signal intercepted at 14 hours and 5 minutes that day. Enemy air attack underway, proceeding at full speed. Then, silence. The U.S. Navy had photographed the explosion from the air. Those pictures, declassified years later, showed the end more clearly than words could describe. A single bright sphere, hundreds of feet high, with the sea folding inward around it like cloth. Analysts calculated that the detonation of Yamato's magazines released energy equivalent to 3,000 tons of TNT, enough to vaporize men and melt armor. In 1953, when Japan regained partial sovereignty, young engineers from Kure Naval Arsenal returned to their old shipyard, now under civilian control. Among them was former Lieutenant Engineer Masao Kobayashi, who had helped install Yamato's turbines 8 years earlier. Standing on the empty dock, he wept. "We gave her the best of us," he said, "and sent her to die without meaning." But memory, like wreckage, endures. By the late 1970s, oceanographers began to search for her remains, using sonar scans and wartime coordinates from U.S. Navy Task Force 58, a Japanese research team aboard the survey vessel Kaiten Maru, detected a large metallic anomaly at a depth of over 1,000 feet. The outline matched Yamato's hull. In 1985, a joint Japanese-American expedition confirmed the find. What they discovered was both majestic and mournful. The wreck lay upright on the seabed, bow embedded in mud, stern twisted by explosion. The massive 18-inch turrets had fallen free, resting yards away like toppled statues. The bridge, once towering with brass and glass, was gone, blown away in the final blast. Yet much of the hull remained intact, armored plates unyielding even after 4 decades underwater. The sea had not erased her, it had entombed her. Television footage from remotely operated cameras transfixed Japan. For the first time, an entire nation looked upon the bones of its greatest ship. The footage showed porcelain teacups still neatly stacked in officers' quarters, tools lying in workshops, a single katana still sheathed beside what had been the captain's cabin. For many Japanese, the images reopened wounds long sealed. Newspapers called her the ship that carried our pride and our sorrow. Schoolchildren wrote essays about her. Veterans made pilgrimages to Kure, leaving flowers at the dry dock where she had been born. Yet historians saw something else beneath the emotion, a mirror of Japan's 20th century transformation. The Yamato had embodied everything the pre-war empire believed about itself. Purity through sacrifice, beauty through strength, victory through will. Her destruction, and Japan's defeat with her, forced a reckoning. Professor Masanori Ito, one of the first post-war naval historians to write openly about the ship, described her as the final poem of steel. He meant it not romantically, but as an epitaph for an age when nations thought they could shape destiny out of iron. She was built to win through courage, he wrote, but courage cannot fuel turbines or deflect bombs. By the 1990s, the Yamato had become legend again, but a different kind of legend. Films, novels, and documentaries transformed her from weapon into metaphor. To older veterans, she was tragedy. To younger generations, she symbolized rebirth, the transformation of a nation that had turned from war to peace. At the Kure Maritime Museum, built near the site of her construction, visitors now walk beneath a 50-foot model of the ship rendered in perfect scale. The details are exact, the gun breeches polished, the decks laid in teak, the turrets angled skyward just as divers found them. Beneath the model, in glass cases, lie artifacts recovered from the wreck, a shattered nameplate, a brass compass, and a sailor's cap stained green by the sea. Every year on April 7th, survivors and families gather on the museum's terrace overlooking the harbour. They throw chrysanthemums into the water and bow their heads toward the horizon. Some whisper names, others remain silent. Among them once stood Masahiro Sasaki, who at age 19 had served as a signalman on Yamato's bridge. In his old age, he often repeated the same words to visitors. We believed she was invincible, but invincible things die too. Only what learns to change survives. Those words capture the true meaning of Yamato's fate. Her guns, her armor, her enormous engines, all were masterpieces of craftsmanship, yet they were born from a nation that mistook strength for invulnerability. Her death proved the opposite, that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. Even now, nearly 80 years later, the Yamato rests in darkness, untouched except by the slow drift of silt and the occasional flicker of deep-sea fish. Her hull remains a tomb for thousands who followed orders they did not believe in, and for an empire that could not admit its own mortality. The last word, perhaps, belongs not to admirals or engineers, but to the sea itself. On calm days in the East China Sea, when the surface lies still and the sun glances off the water, local fishermen say you can sometimes see a faint shimmer rising. From below, a ripple shaped like the curve of a ship's bow. They call it Yamato's breath. It is not a ghost, they say, but a reminder that even the mightiest creations of men must one day fall silent, and that beneath every triumph of steel lies the quiet truth that nothing built for war can ever truly escape the peace that follows. The end of Yamato was not merely the death of a ship, it was the death of an idea. The thunder of her explosion in the East China Sea reverberated far beyond the war's end, echoing into every navy, every doctrine, and every generation that tried to understand how the world had changed. For centuries, nations had measured their strength by the weight of their warships. After April 7, 1945, they began to measure it by the reach of their aircraft and the resilience of their industries. When Japan surrendered 4 months later, the American occupation authorities sent analysts to examine what had gone wrong in the empire's military machine. They found the wreckage of Yamato as the perfect case study. A marvel of engineering, yes, but also a monument to the blindness of pride. Every bolt and bulkhead testified to a nation that had mistaken monumentality for power. The Americans were astonished by the quality of her construction. Even in defeat, she impressed her enemies. Naval engineers studying her blueprints captured from the Kure Arsenal archives marveled at the precision of her gun mounts, the ingenuity of her armor belt, the immaculate welding that even their factories could barely match. Yet they all came to the same conclusion. The perfection of her craftsmanship could not redeem the failure of her purpose. She had been designed for a kind of war that no longer existed. Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz, when asked after the war about Yamato, gave a characteristically simple verdict. She was magnificent and irrelevant. His words distilled the truth that strategists across the world would spend decades dissecting. Japan's wartime gamble on battleships represented the final act of an older age, the age of decisive battle theory. For nearly 40 years, the Imperial Navy's training, funding, and identity had centered around the belief that one great engagement between opposing fleets would decide the Pacific. That battle never came. Instead, victory went to whoever controlled the skies and the supply chains. The Yamato was built to fight a mirror image of herself, but by the time she slid down the slipway at Kure, her real enemies were already invisible. Radar, long-range bombers, aircraft carriers, and a nation capable of building them by the thousands. After the war, surviving Japanese naval officers debated endlessly whether Yamato had ever stood a chance. Some insisted she should have been used earlier, perhaps at Midway or Leyte Gulf, before American air supremacy became absolute. Others argued that her presence would have changed nothing. The truth lies somewhere between tragedy and inevitability. Even if she had fired every shell in her magazines, she could not have turned the tide of a war Japan had already lost in the factories and oil fields it never possessed. Captain Kōsaku Aruga's family received his last photograph from the Navy Ministry in late 1946. In it, he stands on Yamato's bridge, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed toward the horizon. On the reverse side, a sailor had written one line in pencil. He said nothing, but he looked as if he already knew. By the 1950s, both Japan and the United States had begun to reinterpret Yamato's fate through the lens of the Cold War. To Americans, she became proof that technology and industry, not bravery, defined victory in modern war. To the Japanese, she became a parable of hubris, a reminder of what happens when faith in invincibility blinds a nation to reality. At the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force Academy in Etajima, where young officers study both engineering and ethics, Yamato's plans hang in a glass case. Cadets are required to read the last communications between her bridge and her escorts. The final entry, sent at 14:15 on April 7th, reads simply, "We will proceed with attack. May fortune bless His Majesty's Navy." The instructor always pauses after reading it aloud and says, "That is what happens when loyalty replaces judgment." But Yamato's meaning did not end in shame. Out of her ashes, Japan forged a new relationship with technology, one grounded in creation rather than destruction. The engineers who once built warships turned to rebuilding their nation. The same meticulous precision that had shaped her hulls and turbines found new purpose in building merchant vessels, automobiles, and electronics. Within 2 decades, Japan became a global symbol not of militarism, but of industrial mastery. In this sense, the Yamato's story did not conclude beneath the sea, it evolved. Her destruction forced a civilization to reinvent itself. In the 1980s, during the first expedition that filmed the wreck, one of the American engineers aboard the submersible Pisces 3 reportedly said, "It's strange. You can feel respect for her even down here." He wasn't alone. To many who studied her remains, Yamato embodied both the greatness and the folly of human ambition, the drive to build something perfect, even when its time has already passed. Naval architects still study her design for its technical brilliance. Her turrets, each the size of a destroyer, remain marvels of mechanical engineering. Her armor layout influenced post-war cruiser and carrier protection schemes. Even in defeat, she taught her killers. But the deeper lesson of Yamato is not mechanical, it is moral. Strength without foresight becomes weakness. Sacrifice without purpose becomes waste. Every rivet in her hull was a prayer for victory. Every sailor who died aboard her proved that prayer alone cannot change the nature of war. In 1988, when the Kure Maritime Museum opened its Yamato Memorial Hall, the keynote speaker was Admiral Minoru Genda, the former air operations planner of Pearl Harbor. His speech was short and solemn. "The ship named Yamato was built to defend our nation," he said. "She died because we misunderstood what defense means. Let her rest so that no one will ever again build such beauty for such ruin. Today, sonar still traces her silhouette on the seabed bow, pointing toward Okinawa, as if still sailing toward the battle she never reached. Above her lies a calm, indifferent sea, crossed daily by cargo ships carrying the products of a peaceful Japan. None notice the wreck below. None need to. The Yamato's silence has become her message, that the true power of a nation lies not in the size of its guns, but in the wisdom to never need them. Her steel sleeps in darkness, but her lesson endures, echoing softly through history, as enduring as the deep that holds her. In the half-century after Yamato's destruction, the world's oceans changed, but her shadow still lingered beneath their calm surfaces. Nations built new fleets, forged new doctrines, and sent new machines into the sky and space. Yet whenever engineers spoke of size, of strength, of hubris wrapped in steel, her name would surface like a ghost from the deep. For the Japanese people, Yamato became more than a ship. She became an idea mutable, contested, and enduring. In the bleak aftermath of defeat, she was remembered with sorrow. By the 1960s, she was resurrected as symbol, a canvas upon which post-war Japan projected both nostalgia and rebirth. And by the 21st century, she was myth. A floating nation, both tragic and transcendent, carrying the last fragments of an empire that had drowned itself. The paradox of her legacy lay in its transformation. The same ship that had once embodied conquest came to represent peace. The name Yamato, once whispered in awe by admirals, was now spoken tenderly by citizens who had never known war. Children learned of her through films and novels, through the animated starship that bore her name into the cosmos, a vessel that no longer fired shells, but carried the dream of humanity's survival across galaxies. What had begun as the pinnacle of destruction ended as an allegory for hope. In Kure, the city of her birth, the shipyard cranes that once lifted armor plates now assembled commercial vessels for global trade. The roar of welding torches had not vanished, but their purpose had. Every hull that slid into the water bore, in some small way, her inheritance, the craftsmanship, precision, and pride that once built the world's greatest battleship, now devoted to sustaining life instead of ending it. Maritime historians continued to dissect her story in conference halls and museums, passing every decision that had led to her doom. Why had Japan persisted in building battleships when aircraft had already proven supreme? The answer, they concluded, was not technical, but cultural. The Yamato was born of a world view that saw war as art and sacrifice as glory. Her designers could not imagine a future in which a pilot's machine, fragile and fleeting, could decide the fate of nations. They believed in permanence in the divine weight of steel. But permanence, history would show, belongs only to memory. In the 1990s, a second expedition surveyed the wreck. Using advanced sonar, researchers mapped her remains with millimeter accuracy. The data revealed that the explosion which ended her life had torn the ship in two. The forward section lay upright, the aft lay inverted, scattered across the seabed like bones flung by an ancient storm. Between the halves stretched a field of debris gun barrels, fragments of armor, and the faint geometry of collapsed decks. When the images were broadcast, Japan held its breath. The sight of that massive hull, silent beneath miles of water, stirred emotions no monument could contain. Survivors, now grey-haired men in their 70s, watched through tears. 1. Petty Officer Tadashi Amano, who had been rescued unconscious from the sea, whispered to the reporters, "We built her for eternity." And she found it. The Yamato endures precisely because she failed. Her story became proof that technological might cannot outrun the evolution of war, that courage cannot substitute for strategy, and that beauty can exist even within tragedy. She became Japan's mirror, reflecting both its arrogance and its capacity for transformation. In Western navies, too, her memory lingered. American officers studying post-war doctrine used Yamato as a warning against over-investing in any single concept of power. The carrier, dominant in 1945, would itself face obsolescence in time. Submarines, missiles, and satellites would take its place. Every generation of admirals looked upon her story and saw the same truth. No empire holds the future forever. In 2005, to mark the 60th anniversary of her sinking, a memorial service was held aboard the modern helicopter destroyer Hyuga. The ceremony was quiet, dignified. Incense drifted over the deck. Representatives from both Japan and the United States stood side by side, their uniforms immaculate beneath the same sky that once thundered with battle. Rear Admiral Akira Saito, commanding officer of the Maritime Self-Defense Force Flotilla, spoke softly into the sea wind. "The Yamato has not vanished. She lives in our craftsmanship, in our humility, and in our peace. We honor her not for her might, but for the lesson she left us that pride without wisdom leads only to silence." As the sun sank, a wreath of white chrysanthemums was lowered into the water. The petals spread slowly, tracing invisible lines across the waves, as if reaching for something far below. Beneath them, in the darkness where pressure turns steel to dust, the Yamato remains motionless. Her hull, half buried in silt, has become a reef. Small fish dart through her broken hatches. Coral grows over her decks. The sea, indifferent and eternal, has claimed her as part of its architecture. But the echo of her name still rises through that water, through history, through memory, through the quiet realization that humanity's greatest creations often carry within them the seeds of their own extinction. For every empire that builds its dreams in iron, there comes a moment when the ocean answers. The Yamato's final message, unspoken but unmistakable, is written in that silence, that greatness measured by force alone cannot last, that progress without compassion becomes ruin, and that the true measure of power lies not in domination, but in restraint. Her guns are cold, her engines will never turn again. Yet she sails on in the minds of those who study her, build upon her lessons, and vow never to repeat them. And on still nights, when the moon lays a silver path across the East China Sea, sailors say the waves sometimes shape themselves into the faint silhouette of a vast ship moving north, toward home. No sound, no crew, no smoke, only the shape of memory gliding through the dark. They call it Yamato's return, a ghost not of war, but of remembrance, a monument not to destruction, but to what humanity learned when even the mightiest guns on earth fell silent. 80 years have passed since the thunder rolled over the East China Sea, yet Yamato still dreams in the dark. Time, which erases almost everything, has been gentle with her. Where fire once roared, silence now reigns. The ocean's endless rhythm moves over her bones, wrapping the remains of empire in peace. Divers who have descended to her resting place describe an eerie serenity. The wreck lies draped in sediment, her outlines softened by decades of silt and coral. The once gleaming armor plates are mottled with rust blooms and sea growth. But the shape of her bow is unmistakable, broad, proud, defiant even in defeat. The cameras that capture her image relay something beyond ruin. The stubborn endurance of craftsmanship, of men who believed they were building eternity. The deep-sea current that flows over Yamato is cold and slow, yet it carries more than water. It carries memory. Each ripple passes across rivets forged by workers who sang in Kurei's shipyards, across the carved chrysanthemum emblems once polished for imperial inspection. Those emblems are now home to barnacles and soft coral, pale flowers of the sea replacing the symbols of empire. Oceanographers note that Yamato has become an artificial reef, a living monument. Schools of fish swim through her shattered hangar deck, sea turtles nest among the wreckage of her catapults. Nature has repurposed what war abandoned. Life, it seems, refuses to let her end. In a sense, Japan itself has followed the same path. Out of devastation came regeneration. The industrial mastery that once built weapons of conquest became the foundation of a peace-driven nation. Ships for commerce, engines for prosperity, circuits for communication. The ghosts of the shipyards learned to build for life. And yet, whenever new technologies of war arise, hypersonic missiles, autonomous drones, submarines invisible to sonar, the name Yamato still whispers in the background. She is a reminder that even the strongest machines are born into the temporary. Every weapon is a prophecy of its own obsolescence. In naval academies from Annapolis to Yokosuka, her name is still spoken with a mixture of awe and melancholy. Cadets study her not as a blueprint to follow, but as a lesson to never forget. They trace the logic that doomed her, how intelligence was ignored, how faith in tradition overruled evidence, how the pursuit of honor led to extinction. The lesson is brutally clear. When pride commands the bridge, the ship always sinks. Among the few remaining survivors, now frail and silver-haired, that truth has ripened into something like wisdom. Each April, a handful still gather by the sea at Kure. They bring incense, sake, and silence. Some wear the old naval caps, their gold embroidery dulled by time. When the moment of remembrance comes, they bow deeply not toward glory, but toward understanding. One survivor, Seaman Yoshio Morita, once said to a historian, "We were told Yamato would never die. But she did, and we lived." That was her gift to us, to teach that survival is not shame. His words capture what post-war Japan made of its greatest ship, not an altar of revenge, but a school of humility. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of her sinking, a multinational expedition placed a small bronze plaque on the seafloor beside the wreck. It bears no national flag, no emblem of rank, only a single line in English and Japanese. "Here rests the pride of men who learned too, that courage must bow to reason." The inscription glints faintly under the submersible's lights before fading again into shadow. Down there, even human language begins to dissolve. The sea has its own silence, its own way of keeping history. Scholars who study Yamato's cultural afterlife often call her Japan's steel mirror. In her reflection lies every contradiction of the 20th century: beauty and horror, invention and ruin, loyalty and delusion. The ship's story refuses to end because it speaks to something larger than war. It speaks to the eternal human tendency to build gods out of metal, to worship them, and to mourn them when they fall. There is poetry in her resting place. The coordinates of her wreck are almost exactly halfway between Japan and Okinawa, the homeland and the frontier, the dream and its undoing. She lies there like a punctuation mark between what Japan was and what it became. Every few years, another documentary revisits her. High-definition cameras reveal the corrosion of her hull, the slow encroachment of the deep. Yet, no matter how advanced the imaging becomes, there remains a sense that the sea protects her, allowing only glimpses, never full revelation. It is as if the ocean itself has chosen to guard her dignity. In that secrecy lies her immortality. Yamato was built to dominate the surface. Now she rules the depths, commanding reverence rather than fear. Her silence has outlasted her guns. Perhaps that is the final irony, that the ship whose purpose was destruction now fosters life, whose mission was death now teaches peace, whose noise has become silence that the world still listens to. As the sun sets, each April 7th, the waters above her glow gold and crimson. From the air, it looks like a wound closing. From below, perhaps, it feels like forgiveness. No bells toll for her now. No salutes fire. Only the endless whisper of the current, the soft drift of silt, and the faint hum of a world that has learned, at last, to live without giants. And so Yamato sleeps neither defeated nor victorious, but transformed. She endures as all great stories do, not in the roar of her guns, but in the quiet understanding that follows. Her empire lies beneath coral and memory. Her legend sails on every wave that crosses the East China Sea. And her final message, born on the tides of history, remains unchanged. Even the mightiest steel must yield to the sea. And from that surrender, humanity learns to begin again.